How's it going? Bowman here with another episode of Esports Meditation. And today's topic is esports betting. It's a huge scene that's growing rapidly in a lot of different ways this year. And we're going to be talking about the different impacts that scene is going to have in esports in general. And kind of the positives and the negatives of the esports betting. We'll dive a little bit into the history, quick impact on the scene. We're going to discuss skill versus chance, money versus in-game content, and then we'll finish off, diving into some of the investigations around betting and gambling and stuff like that are going to directly affect the esports scene, whether in the positive or the negative. But the results of those investigations will have an impact either way. Now, sport betting in general is about a $3 trillion business. It is huge as far as the amount of money that's coming in and out. And so it makes sense that with esports, on the rise and a lot, there's a significant amount of people who are getting actively involved in the esports betting side of things. Something that's one fact that's kind of strange about it is betting on sports and esports right now is not regulated in any way, shape, or form. I think worldwide it's less than 15% of esports betting is visible to regulators, and in the United States it's 3% is visible to regulators. And that's going to be one of the challenges going forward, especially as we dive into some of the investigations when we for esports betting and for betting in general, as far as making it last in a long time. Specifically for esports, last year was a great year for companies in the involved in the betting scene in esports, because about $150 million was invested into the esports scene, which is a lot of money, especially considering that's potentially about 20% of the revenue generated in esports scene at all. Now, it was a little bit slow on the uptake last year as far as actual revenue generated by the esports betting scene. It was only about $56 million generated. And part of that is due to players' reluctance to put real money into the betting scene. We have a lot of players that are have no problem betting in-game items, like in Counter-Strike and in Dota, and they're betting their skins. Like, I spent a gift card that I got for Christmas once on opening a bunch of cases in Counter-Strike. It was kind of interesting seeing the different skins I got, and the betting scene with CS:GO Lounge and other sites like that is very large, but it's all in-game items as well. And obviously when there's money involved and when there's teams involved, just like in regular sports, where there's, every now and then there's lots of controversy where someone places money on different teams and the outcomes and stuff like that. In esports, we've had quite a few instances of people throwing matches. A big famous one, obviously, is the CEVO Pro Season 5 iBuyPower instance, where right after they got back from the major, their next match, they had a third party place a bunch of bets against their team, and they purposely threw the match. And it all came out through leaked text messages from an irate ex-girlfriend. A lot of you have probably heard that story to death, so I won't dive too much more into it. But since there's so much money in betting in general, and esports is very new to it now, there's going to be instances like this. But I don't want this to come off as a rant about betting's bad, because there's lots of positive things to betting as well. Let's talk about players and why and how they bet currently. A lot of people who do the fantasy esports and do the betting and stuff like that, they're betting in their comfort zone, and mainly because of in-game items. You go to CS:GO Lounge, where you place your items, and you bet them to the outcome of the next match. Like just before I recorded this, there's an ESL qualifying tournament going on in Counter-Strike, and I'm sure CS:GO Lounge was going crazy over those matches because they were very interesting matches, especially the outcomes. I'll check here in a little bit at the outcome of the final match. But a mentality that a lot of players have when they're betting in-game items is they don't feel like it's real money. Yes, did they spend real money initially on buying the keys to unlock cases and various things like that? Yes, but like when you spend $250 $2.50 unlocking a key, and you get a $400 knife, you know, you don't feel like you spent $400 when you then rebet that knife on the outcome of a match. So that comfort zone for a lot of players is important to the betting scene, because those in-game items don't make them feel like they're necessarily losing their real money. But there is real money sites out there. Obviously, you got Alpha Draft and Vulcan, and in the larger sports, you have Fantasy Draft and DraftKings and those companies that all bet in real money for these different type of betting websites. In esports, there's actually on average about 40% of esports viewers participate in some form of betting. Which is actually very exciting, because those 40% are usually very actively engaged in those matches. Not just the watching it for fun, like a lot of us watch, but they're actually following statistics and following their players. And usually, when we, with like fantasy esports, they have players from multiple teams, which means they're going to actually watch multiple matches throughout the day, which means that viewers watching more esports matches. You're getting more active engagement because they're following the statistics and everything like that for those players to try to make sure they actually win some money. Because, with following the scene in an active way is the best way in fantasy esports to win money at that thing. But it is very positive. But on the flip side, the real money betting sites in esports have not grown as much as the investors would have liked, but it is still growing, and so the money being put into that will definitely pay off in the long run. So now there's different types of fantasy, not just fantasy, different type of betting in esports. The biggest, probably most popular one, is fantasy, where you literally pick your players and form your own super team. Then basically you get points and statistics based on how well they play that day. And if you're in the top of your group, you win money. So match wagers like CSGO Lounge and Dota Lounge is where you literally just bet in-game items or money on the outcome of a match. Like the upcoming CSGO match on ESL, that's actually probably happening right now. I'm sure there's tons of people betting on it currently, about just for the simple fact of, they think one team's going to win. Now, there are other types of betting sites that are less skill. They're not really skill involved. Like, you have a lot of CSGO, you have a lot of lottery sites, you have a lot of jackpot sites, where it's literally you just throw in-game items into a pool, and each, like, say, each penny worth of that your item is, you get a ticket, and it throws it out, a random ticket out at the end, random, and someone wins the whole pot. That, in my opinion, is not so much a game of skill, versus where fantasy you can definitely take some skill into it, where you follow the statistics of the players and where they're having slumps and rises and matchups and all that stuff. And if a fan really dives into the nitty gritty of those details and the matchups of the players that are on their fantasy team, I think there's definitely a skill to it. And you actually, if you dive into the stories of some of the successful people who play fantasy sports and fantasy esports, it's almost like a part-time job for them. And to where some of them even have Excel documents filled with statistics of players down, so that we know every single week whose their ideal team is. That's going to net them probably the most fantasy points. Now, obviously, they're whether or not you're following statistics and choosing your team, and whether or not you're leaving it up to chance, that actually leads into why esports is actually being investigated in a lot of ways. Because there's, for instance, there was an instance where, like between, I think it's FanDuel and DraftKings, there was an instance where one of the employees for one of the companies accidentally leaked out information as far as the top percentage picks in fantasy sports, and also the top percentage players who were generating the most income, the most fantasy points for that week. And that employee happened to end up winning like over $30,000 that week, which obviously raised some red flags when those kind of all corresponded together. And that, is a similar story behind a lot of investigations. And actually, in last October, in 2015, there was 42 investigations opened against a lot of these fantasy sports sites. And the FBI has even been rumored to be sending agents to investigate and everything like that. Now, there are, laws in place that, allow the fantasy esports and the online betting scene to kind of thrive, because if it is a game of skill versus a game of chance, it's not technically gambling based on how the laws are written right now. And that's where fantasy sports in general and fantasy esports currently falls into that category, because they're defining themselves as a game of skill, which I personally believe there is a level of skill to it, because if you take that time to follow and track the players in the scene of that sport and the matchups they're going to have the next week, whether it's football or whether it's League of Legends, there is a skill to recognizing the patterns and putting together a good team where you're gonna, as Thorin says, win some Skrilla. So, but obviously currently those investigations are ongoing, and a lot of those cases that are being brought, I believe, to those courts, involve insider trading and fraud. I believe 36 of those 42 are insider trading. Which is, if you're not familiar with insider trading, it was like that first example where information about and statistics involved on the inside of these esports and not esports, I'm sorry, these fantasy sports companies are being leaked and used to place bets for personal gains. And insider trading, whether it's stocks or anything like that, is technically illegal in a lot of cases. And how this is all going to affect esports is, if the hammers, dropped on fantasy sports in general, that's going to directly affect fantasy esports, and that's going to directly affect esports betting, and to where basically it's all going to be illegal. Now, obviously, those cases are still pending, and currently, as the law sits, fantasy sports and fantasy esports is legal because they're classifying it as a game of skill, and that has been held up in a few other smaller courts on the state level, but also the opposite at the state level in a few other states. Fantasy sports has been deemed illegal. I believe Nevada actually made it illegal, which is ironic considering Nevada has Las Vegas, but obviously, with the federal cases now, we'll get a more definite answer going forward. So ultimately, what it comes down to, as we've been talking about, is it a game of skill? Is it a game of chance? I believe fantasy, esports, you could definitely find reason to see it as a game of skill. Those sites where it's like the jackpot, where everyone just throws stuff into a pool and some random person wins, that's clearly a game of chance. And I could definitely see at the end of these rulings that sites like that would definitely have to shut down or change their format to fit within the words of the law. Now currently, obviously, they're all happening. And again, with, like, in the United States, less than 3% of that type of online betting being actually monitored by the regulators. Obviously, there's lots of things that are going to fall through the cracks. And one specifically case that the IRS has brought up a little bit is excise tax. There's specific excise tax for incomes generated from games of skill and games of chance. And the one question that might become the fallout if the investigations go a certain way, is are all these companies, in the know of that excise tax and actually paying it? So, my gut says after these investigations and the court rulings, there's going to be a better definition for what clarifies a game of chance versus a game of skill. But the biggest fallout will probably be on the tax side, to where a lot of these online companies for even fantasy esports are going to have to look into the taxes, especially that excise tax that specifically covers pretty much all gambling in general, whether it's a game of skill or a game of chance. And so there's probably going to be some income tax based on that's going to be owed from a lot of those companies. and that might be the biggest fallout of the whole thing. Well, and I don't know the fines or anything that may be attached as well. So we'll see how these investigations turn out. Obviously, everything's still up in the air. Obviously, none of those websites have been taken down. And millions of people are betting tons of money on it. Again, $56 million was generated in revenue from the esports betting scene. And it's only going to grow. But to end it today, we're going to kind of talk about the positive side of esports betting because, obviously gambling and betting has been, in human nature and human culture for a long time. It's, whether it's playing poker, whether it's playing, dice like in the olden days, horse betting, all that stuff, it's not going to go away. And one of the biggest positive effects that gambling and betting has is viewer engagement. People who have, whether it's an in-game item or money on the line for a particular event, are typically more engaged. They look at the statistics and and they follow these teams and these players, so that way they can actually make better decisions. Where they're placing their money, where they're placing their bets, and for esports, that's actually huge. Considering there's over 40% of people who watch esports are already actively engaging in some sort of form of betting, in the esports scene. That's a huge chunk of, say if you're watching League of Legends, you decide to do fantasy League of Legends, and you pick 5 players for your team, and they happen to be from 4 different teams because you chose some star players or some really good matchups for that week. So if you're watching 4 different teams, you're watching, minimum 2 to 4 matches for that particular week. Whether or not they're playing, those teams are playing each other or not. But, compared to if, say, you just have a favorite team or one favorite player, you maybe watch one match. Well, that person who's invested in that fantasy is now going to take more time out of their day to make sure they follow those players closely. They watch their play, they see how they match up against different players, so that way, later in the season when they come back around and they got to play that same team again, excuse me, and there's a matchup, they're gonna pay attention more, and they're going to watch more things. Obviously, for the real money side of things, or even the in-game items for like Valve, it's a huge revenue source. Considering, as we said, sports betting's over $3 trillion. To start to tap into that in the esports scene, a lot of companies would be dumb not to pursue it in some way, or at least direct their fans to it in some way, because it's only going to generate more revenue, as again the house always wins at the end of the day, and it's going to increase viewership, as we mentioned. Now the international impact, a lot of these esports and the tournaments are international. Like Counter-Strike is set up like how the tennis circuit is in tennis, to where you have a bunch of minor tournaments that are localized to different regions, and your teams will travel to those things and qualify. Like tonight's the the ESL Katowice qualifier for North America, but they're going to go to Katowice for if they qualify for that major. So you have a huge international impact, especially if with these online betting sites, because some countries like Australia in particular has a huge history of gambling and esports. And, at the end of the day, I don't think gambling should be illegal or anything like that. I don't think these websites should be shut down. But as far as what I do think should happen, is I do think there should be more regulation around it. And not regulation as far as limiting it, but regulation so that way it's done in a way that protects everyone involved, protects the companies, protects the sports, and it maintains the integrity of the sports. Because obviously we don't want instances like the iBuyPower instance where teams match fix or anything like that, because obviously we want to prevent that. We want to secure that integrity of those matches so that we can get the most entertainment out of them. But we also want our fans to be engaged. We also want them to be actively involved in any way they can, because that's how we're going to grow. That's how esports is going to grow. And betting's just another tool to grow the business, to grow esports, to grow a lot of things. And I think it definitely needs to be embraced, but embraced in a way to make sure that everyone's taken care of, everyone is protected, and everyone, again, maintains the integrity of the sports. Well, thank you very much. That's going to wrap it up here for today. Hopefully, in the next couple weeks, we're going to have some interviews with a few different organizations and groups around the scene. Don't forget to favorite, like it, share it as you see fit, and follow me on Twitter. But other than that, everyone have a great day.